Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Access Blockbusters Pod. Thank you so much for joining me as we continue on in our series of podcast episodes that we're going to be releasing throughout the next coming months and weeks on the Access Blockbusters channel and the Access Blockbusters Pod, rewatching all the DCEU projects as we look forward to the coming of the new DCEU. Thank you again so much for joining. It is a pleasure to have you here. And a quick reminder before we get into the video, if you haven't subscribed to the Access Blockbusters YouTube channel or the Access Blockbusters Pod, make sure to subscribe on the YouTube channel. The podcast, as always, will be there. And then the podcast episode will also be uploaded to Anchor and subsequently on Spotify as well. So if you prefer to listen audio only, it will be on Spotify, and then the video version will be on YouTube. So make sure to subscribe to the channel for more content like this. And guys, let's not dilly-dally too long. I have so much to say about this movie, Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice, so I really don't want to waste much more time here. I just have tons and tons and tons of notes, and I can already imagine that this is going to be a very, very long episode, so settle in. We're going to be talking about a lot of different things as we go on. But I'm really excited to talk to you about this film. As you guys might have seen with other rewatches that I've done on the YouTube channel, including with the MCU, with Phase 4, the Infinity Saga, with Star Wars, and with Spider-Man, this is just an opportunity for me to take another look at these projects that I haven't really seen in a long time. And that includes Star Wars, especially, and Spider-Man, but especially the DCEU. I haven't seen a lot of these films really since they came out in theaters. And so I'm really quite excited to get a better look and another look just at all with these projects and sort of just get to re-experience them now that all the extenuating circumstances and all the context surrounding them is over. I'm very much looking forward to continuing this series. I've had I really unique and different experiences watching both Batman v Superman and Man of Steel again. Both, I think, Man of Steel for the second time ever and Batman v Superman for the third time, but the Ultimate Edition for the second time. We'll talk about that in just a second. So, again, this is just really a chance for me to kind of sit back and take in these films now that it's been almost 10 years since Batman v Superman came out, and just talk about it, talk about it as a film. And hopefully it's a great chance for you guys to reminisce along with me. I know that these DCEU films are not necessarily as universally beloved as maybe some of the MCU films per se, but I mean, that's okay, right? I think it's really interesting, and it's just as constructive to have all this differing conversation and commentary around films like this. And so I'm really excited to hear what you guys have to say about these films. As always, though, make sure that the comment section is a place of respect. Again, at the end of the day, these are just pieces of entertainment, and just really be respectful of one another as well as my opinion, and we'll just have a great time. I welcome differing opinions about the film. I understand that my opinion is not going to be the universal one, and so really just hoping again for some constructive conversation. With all that being said, before we jump into the into the podcast episode, just a quick disclaimer and quick upfront about the structure of today's episode. Like always with these rewatches, I'm going to be talking about sort of the context, both in terms of the theaters and then in terms of my own personal context before the film actually came out in 2016. And then we're going to kind of dive into a play-by-play of the film, where I'm going to talk about, I just took notes on basically the entire film, things that I noticed, things that I enjoyed, things that I didn't enjoy, things that struck me this time around. And then at the end, we're going to talk about how my thoughts might have changed from the last time I had seen the film. So without further ado, let's get into it. So 2016 was a big year for superhero films. We had sort of the culmination of this sort of hero versus hero kind of matchup going on. We had Captain America: Civil War coming out. That was in May of 2016, and we had Batman v Superman in March of 2016. And it's funny because you had sort of the two titular icons of the MCU and the budding DCEU pitted against each other in the same year. And I don't know if you guys remember, but actually there was a time when these two films were going to come out on the same day, which is kind of crazy to me to think about. But eventually I think Batman v Superman moved up the May date to March, or it might have been Civil War off the March date to May. But anyways, they released a couple months apart from each other. Now, Batman v Superman was coming out in a very different context from Captain America: Civil War. If you guys remember that very famous San Diego Comic-Con, I believe 2014, when they announced the Man of Steel sequel. But I forget who it was on stage, but someone was on stage and he started reading this quote. I believe it was from The Dark Knight Returns. You can correct me in the comments though if it wasn't. about Batman, and so you see then the screen goes black. You can look this clip up on YouTube. The screen goes black, the whole Hall H goes black, and you see the Superman logo show up, but then the Batman logo slowly slowly emerges from the background, and that was our first inclination of Batman v Superman. And then from there we got even more clues that this was going to be a big film that was going to set up the rest of the DCU, including, of course, Gal Gadot as Wonder Woman. This was her first entrance into the DCEU, and she would play Wonder Woman, I want to say 5 times total in the DCEU. She was in and out of a lot of these different films, interestingly enough. And so, yeah, it was the beginning of this universe. You had Man of Steel, which made a decent bit of money, I believe in the $600 to $700 million range, but wasn't necessarily critically successful. It was about a 50 to 60% on Rotten Tomatoes, and it was sort of a little bit divisive amongst the fans. But Zack Snyder was back to direct Batman v Superman, and he was kind of doubling down on the similar tone, if not even a darker, more grittier tone than Man of Steel even was, which itself was a little bit more serious than we had been used to, compared to the MCU that was going on for about 10 or so years at that point when Man of Steel came out. So we got our first trailers, we got our first glimpses of Batman v Superman. And I mean, one of my core memories that I have is, seeing Batman v Superman final trailer. We had already seen 2 trailers, and they both looked really, really cool. We saw the Batman sort of mech armor, some shots that were very reminiscent of The Dark Knight Returns. I think the first trailer that they dropped is still one of my favorite trailers of any movie, any superhero movie. It's sort of the teaser trailer where you have this voiceover going on over the statue of Superman that's, Superman needs to be held accountable, and then I believe it kind of zooms in and it says false god, and then we get our first glimpses of Ben Affleck as Batman, who looked fantastic in my opinion. I know a lot of people hated that casting choice. I was sort of ambivalent on it. I was like, yeah, I just kind of want to see what he does from here instead of, jumping all over the casting. I will say, though, while I never am one to, immediately judge a casting choice right off the bat, I was a little skeptical, more than a little skeptical, of Jesse Eisenberg as Lex Luthor when that was first announced as well. But you know what? I mean, I was in no position to be like, well, I'm going to write him off, even before the film comes out. So that was something that I was thinking about before Batman v Superman. But we got that first trailer, got a glimpse of Batman in the costume, which looked fantastic. And the second trailer as well looked really good. But then we got the third trailer. And like I said, this was a really core memory because I remember watching the third trailer, which opens up with that scene where Clark Kent and Bruce Wayne are talking at the Gala at Lex Luthor's house. And it was a fun scene, and then we got some more glimpses of Batman and Superman, and then all of a sudden, we get this scene where Superman's like, "What have you done?" to Lex Luthor, and then out of nowhere comes Doomsday, and then out of nowhere comes Wonder Woman, and we get the Trinity shot at the end, and all of a sudden, I was a bit worried about the movie because it no longer felt like it, it felt more Dawn of Justice than it did Batman v Superman, which is a bummer because, I mean, if you just kind of look at the subtitle on its own, Dawn of Justice is clearly just Justice League setup. And while you can expect Justice League setup in a film like Batman v Superman, obviously the price of admission is Batman v Superman. So it was a little concerning because then it kind of felt like you could read the whole film, like eventually Batman and Superman are going to make up and then team up with Wonder Woman and then fight Doomsday, and it's going to end and it's going to, so that was something that I was a little bit concerned about. That being said, I watched the film, and I, at the time, this was 2016, right? I kind of thought this film is interesting. I didn't like the Martha ending, even in theaters at the time. And for the most part, though, I was just there to kind of enjoy the visuals and take in the film for what it was. So I wasn't a particularly big hater of the movie. That being said, I don't think I came out of it immediately enjoying it super much. I think I did see it again one more time. And then after that, there was the Ultimate Edition that came out. And I was intrigued with the Ultimate Edition. I feel like I watched the Ultimate Edition all the way through when it came out, I think a few months later, although I might very well have just skimmed through it because honestly, the Ultimate Edition didn't leave a super long-lasting impression on me. That being said, it might have just been because I had seen the film a couple times already and I was just kind of over it at that point. Because, yeah, I mean, while I enjoyed it somewhat, it wasn't my favorite superhero movie that had come out in the recent past. And that was comparing it to films like X-Men Days of Future Past coming out, Captain America Civil War, Avengers, and Winter Soldier. So it really didn't stack up that well at the time. But that being said, I definitely wasn't someone who hated the film. Going forward. So this time around, I decided to watch the Ultimate Edition. the 3-hour Batman v Superman Ultimate Edition. It would have been maybe beneficial in a certain sense to have watched both the regular edition and the Ultimate Edition to have seen what the difference was. That is, 5.5 hours of content. If this video gets like 6,000 likes and 100,000 views and I get, 100 subscribers from this, like maybe I will, consider watching the regular Batman v Superman normal edition. And make a comparison video. But honestly, at this point, I just thought the Ultimate Edition, just giving the film as much benefit of the doubt as I could. Because, I heard many people say that the Ultimate Edition was, it was really something that saved the film for some people. And for other people, it was just something that was, helpful when looking at the film. So without any further ado, let's jump into Batman v Superman. It's going to be a long podcast. I have a lot of things to say. But yeah, I'm super excited to talk about it. So let's get into these notes that I took here. So the first thing, I guess I wrote a note here that I wrote before even the film started, and I'd seen these movies before, so it wasn't like I was writing this in complete ignorance, like I hadn't seen the film before. But it's been a while, right? And so one of the things I noted, if you want to go check out my Man of Steel rewatch podcast, it's up on the YouTube channel and on Spotify, is that at the end of Man of Steel, I had commented on the fact that while I enjoyed the direction that Zack Snyder took with Man of Steel, a more stoic and tortured and kind of conflicted Superman, there were hints of a more joyous Superman at the end of the film. And it was kind of clear that this was sort of growing into the more happy, optimistic Superman that, frankly, I had been more familiar with before Man of Steel and Batman v Superman. And so one thing I wrote before starting BVS is that, and I know that BVS was a sort of a darker film. I didn't remember too much about Superman, though. And so one thing I was commenting on was I was going to be very curious to see whether or not that carried through into BVS in any particular way, that kind of character progression that Zack Snyder himself started in Man of Steel, but then he was taking the mantle up in the next film, Batman v Superman. So I was kind of curious to see what happened. But before even we get to Superman, we have to start with Batman. And look, I mean, it's 2016, right? Like 2014 is the quintessential. It's the origin story, period. 2013, I mean. With Man of Steel. So you have the origin story of Superman. What else came out, during that time? You had The Amazing Spider-Man in 2012 with another origin story. So it was, it was just that kind of time. And so, yeah, 2016, while we were kind of getting tired of the fact that we were going to see this origin story again, and we had just seen the origin story of Batman in 2008, I believe, with Batman Begins, or not 2008, maybe 2005 with Batman Begins. I mean, I don't ever really hate seeing the origin story of Batman, especially when it's done in this kind of stylized, quick way that a lot of these superhero films have been doing, like The Incredible Hulk, for example, that did a kind of stylized version of Bruce Banner's origin. I don't mind it as much because at least you're not, dragging it out for longer than it needs to be dragged out for. So I do appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, it's sort of a very Zack Snyder kind of opening. I'm sure that if yet another Batman film like The Brave and the Bold or whatever, I appreciate the Batman not doing the origin story. But yeah, I mean, it's interesting because right off the bat, it feels very much like a Batman movie and not a Superman movie. And I think that that's very intentional on Zack Snyder's part to start it out like that. You also get the foreshadowing of the Martha thing with, Thomas Wayne saying Martha right before she dies. And I will say that, if you want to listen to my Man of Steel rewatch podcast, it has a very similar feel in terms of the dialogue as well with the opening monologue from Bruce Wayne. It has that sort of same Shakespearean, a little over dramatized, a little oversaturated kind of dialogue. But I suppose in the sort of monologue format, it works a little better than when characters are just talking to each other one-on-one. So, Bruce Wayne it starts out the film with this monologue of "it was all a beautiful lie," whatever my parents told me. So yeah, I mean, it was pretty solid. But what I love even more is then they go back into the end of Man of Steel, and like I said, it was something that I noticed, and I'm sure a lot of people noticed at the time because there was a lot of complaints about this, and Zack Snyder listened, is just the amount of collateral damage and the amount of just buildings and people that were killed. And all of that. And I will say that as Ben Affleck enters the scene, although one wonders why Bruce Wayne was helicoptered into Metropolis in the middle of an alien invasion, because I don't think we got a super clear explanation. Like, why did Bruce Wayne himself have to be there? Obviously, no one knew he was Batman, and so it wasn't like he himself was physically, like Wayne Enterprises was like, oh, Bruce Wayne is our most, he's our rescue team or whatever. I don't think they knew that. It was a little weird. But I will say that Ben Affleck looks really good in this opening. I haven't rewatched the Justice League film, either the original or the Zack Snyder version, which that is a movie that I will watch both versions of and make separate episodes on because I think it warrants that. That being said, I do remember in the later versions of Bruce Wayne Batman that we get that Ben Affleck looked a little bored, looked a little bit out of it, and everything that he detailed from the Joss Whedon, shooting of Justice League was that he was very much not into the whole thing. And so what I do appreciate, at least from this part, because I remember him looking very tired in the Justice League film, and maybe that was part of the character or part of just Ben Affleck's life. He looks very determined and he looks very committed to this role. And he looks like, he's really buying into this version of Bruce Wayne and Batman, which I really enjoy. So again, we get this very direct continuity between Man of Steel and Batman v Superman. And I think that this is really setting up a perfect motivation for why Batman would think Superman was a danger to society. I think that it's honestly really brilliantly done because right off the bat, in the first 15 minutes of the film, you get an exact reason why Bruce Wayne thinks that Superman is a menace to society. And on top of the fact that this is a very jaded Batman, it really adds to that character dimensionality. And I totally buy why Batman is, right off the bat, he thinks that Superman is a threat. So really good opening, and it got me hooked on from there. From there, we get on to the discovery of the kryptonite, which I believe was near the crash site of the World Engine or in the Indian Ocean, wherever that big machine was in Man of Steel. That was interesting. It was something I hadn't noticed before. Obviously, with any film where Batman is fighting Superman, kryptonite is going to be a huge part of that. And I don't really blame the film for that. It's it's kind of a tried and true thing of how do you beat Superman with kryptonite. It becomes sort of a MacGuffin in the film, kind of doesn't. I think it was handled pretty fine. So we get the discovery of kryptonite in the ocean, and that becomes a thing that everybody wants later on. Next, we head to Africa, where Lois Lane is ending up for this story, which it's interesting because Lois Lane works for the Daily Planet, and the Daily Planet has this very small scale kind of feel, but then in certain places it almost feels like Perry is just letting Lois do literally anything for any story that she wants, which is interesting. So now she's sort of in Africa in a very dangerous situation, as it turns out, which I don't know. It is what it is. I guess they just kind of let Lois Lane as a character do whatever she wants, or whatever she needs to do to kind of further the story along. But anyways, one of the things that I read that and we're going to read out all the changes that the Ultimate Edition made at the very end of this podcast episode and talk about whether or not I think that they added to the film. But it's relevant to talk about it here and now because one of the big changes that Zack Snyder made is making that unnamed photographer character who gets killed, Jimmy Olsen. And look, I'm not a comic book reader, right? But I'm versed enough to know that Jimmy Olsen is a very critical part of sort of the Superman lore. He's obviously not like a Justice League member kind of character, but he's pretty important to Superman's cast of characters. And so this is just one of the decisions, and you're going to see that I have commented on many of them throughout the film that are it's just bizarre that Zack Snyder had, made some of these decisions that he did. And one of those being that you're going to name this character Jimmy Olsen and then kill him immediately. And I just can't imagine. I don't know if this is Zack Snyder, if this is Chris Terrio, David S. Goyer, who are the writers of the film. Who thought this was a good idea initially, and then what the conversations were like that none of them decided this was a bad idea. Because honestly, this is... Even I, as someone who has zero attachment to Jimmy Olsen as a character from the comic books, think this is a terrible idea because that character could have been anybody, and I just don't understand why this was, what the point of that was. And so so then at a certain, he's not even the photographer, though he's a CIA plant, and this second sort of opening to the film in Africa is a very frenetic and kind of confusing opening, which I suppose is meant to be that way because you're kind of unraveling this mystery as the film goes on about who's really involved and what's going on. But then you have Jimmy Olsen as a CIA plant, and then he gets killed, and it's just a very bizarre decision. And while this opening sequence, I do believe, like I said, is meant to be a little bit confusing, I don't think it's meant to be confusing in sort of the way that it's shot and sort of all the sudden cuts and things like that. And I just think that compared to the opening in Metropolis, which is very assured and very confidently done, this feels a little frantic and panicky, if that makes sense. And so, I wrote in my notes that I hope that all this stuff becomes clear later on. I really did I think I like a lot of it makes a little bit more sense as it goes along, but I don't think it necessarily justifies how the opening is set up. So yeah, I mean, we get this image of these people who are basically just trying to draw Superman in. I mean, that was pretty obvious from the beginning that this is all sort of a ploy to get Superman to come and fight Lois. One of the interesting things, going back to that earlier point about whether I want, how I wanted Superman to kind of be a little bit more jovial, perhaps, and a little bit more like the traditional Superman, is that when Superman arrives to save Lois, he looks straight up evil. If you compare that shot of when Superman lands in that building when the guy has a gun to Lois's head or is holding her captive, compared to that shot of Superman as he's walking up to Batman in the nightmare sequence, it's like, this is an evil Superman, and that was a little disappointing. It was pretty disappointing to me, because I mean, this kind of Superman had no fear on his face. He just kind of looked like a murderous version of Superman, and that was, again, just a little disappointing. And also, he flew, and I guess the implication is he didn't kill that guy, but it kind of seemed like he killed that guy. Anyways, I just, it was, this opening was definitely a lot weaker to me than the Metropolis opening. Now, just a quick aside here is that while I was watching this part of the film, I kind of thought to myself, I don't want to compare the DCEU films to the MCU, but let's compare, just for the sake of comparing tones, the DCEU films to something like a Dark Knight or the Dark Knight trilogy, which is interesting because Christopher Nolan was sort of touted as bringing a gravitas and a groundedness back to the superhero genre. But it's interesting because that groundedness was significantly different. It was not the same kind of groundedness that we see in this version of the DCEU. This is more of a like gritty for the sake of gritty kind of film, where it's not like, I think the Dark Knight had a levity to it as well that wasn't necessarily manifest in jokes. Like the MCU likes to have its levity in jokes. I think the Dark Knight had a levity in sort of its humanity, whereas I think so far as I'm watching Batman v Superman up to this point, it's very much a darkness that's sort of grounded in the circumstances and the overall, I hate to say depressing, but sort of sad nature of what's going on. So it's just something to note, right? And you kind of continue on here with this introduction of Batman, where he brands people basically. Again, I get this more for a Batman, which is why I think that the parts that focus in on Batman's character are really well done in this regard. If you're going to tell a very gritty, dark, jaded version of Batman, which I think it is. It's supposed to be. So kudos to Snyder and kudos to the writer for really painting Ben Affleck in a very three-dimensional, understandable light in this way. I just think this doesn't work for Superman as a character in the same film. We'll go through the film as we go along, but you're going to see my thoughts as we develop here, that I really think that this should have just been a Batman film, somehow. Without the Superman part of it, but we'll kind of get to there as we go along. And so, as we kind of progress into the film, we're leaving from Africa, and Lois takes from Africa. She takes the notebook with the bullet in it that she's trying to study here, and I think that with all these different subplots that are starting to emerge now, it just sort of feels like there's very little rhythm to it. It just feels like it's a lot of different scenes kind of just put together. Another thing I noticed is that it didn't stand out to me as much in Man of Steel, because in Man of Steel, Henry Cavill is supposed to be more muted, and he's a little bit more stoic. But here it just kind of feels like he's very wooden. His delivery to me. And again, I have nothing against Henry Cavill as an actor. I think he's great and he's good and everything. And he was great in Mission Impossible Rogue Nation. And, I think I have nothing against Henry Cavill, especially as Superman, by the way. But he's just not my favorite Superman because he feels so muted and so almost desaturated, if that makes sense. Especially even his line delivery as Superman doesn't feel stoic in the way that like a Boy Scout kind of Superman would, but more stoic in the sense of like an Eeyore kind of character would, if that makes some sense. It's just strange. And also then there's this bathtub scene which feels so random. I just like that scene was in the trailer even, and at the time I thought this is so random, and even in the movie I'm like, this is so random. Anyways, we get to see the Batcave now. I really like Alfred. I really like Jeremy Irons as Alfred, even though again, going back to that same tone, even this version of Alfred seems really cynical and sardonic and sarcastic versus, and the Michael Caine version was sarcastic at times, but he was also very kind and warm. I think the Andy Serkis version is, he's a little less involved in the film, but he still really kind of brings that warmth to that role. This version of Alfred is just there to basically be snippy with Bruce Wayne, and I guess that is, that's in line with the film. But they're looking for this white Portuguese, and it turns out later that it's a boat, but they're looking for it because later it's revealed that he's looking for the kryptonite, and so Alfred's warning basically that, hey, look, Batman, your vengeance is going to turn you cruel, to which I believe he's just like, yep, that's basically the path that we're going down. Speaking of discombobulated subplots and sort of feeling like this film is going all over the place, we get our introduction to Lex Luthor. So, like I said at the beginning of this podcast episode, I try to leave all of my preconceived notions about whether it's castings or whether it's different set photos or whatever, because that's not what the intent, like, it's not what the directors intend for us to see, right? It's the movie is what we are supposed to see in its finished product. And so I said, look, perhaps this is a case of a Heath Ledger as Joker or Hugh Jackman as Wolverine or RDJ as Iron Man, where before the casting you kind of go, I don't quite see it, and then it turns out that it's just perfect, right? So I was willing to say perhaps this vision of Lex Luthor is going to blow me away. And so again, I've had sort of some 360s on certain characters where at least I found them a little less annoying. I know this is a much less extreme example, but over the years, I found that the Darcy character in the Thor movies has been much less annoying to me in general. And so I just thought maybe this time around, I'd seen The Social Network, I think once or twice since Batman v Superman. That he gave a great performance in The Social Network, Jesse Eisenberg. I also really liked him in the Now You See Me movie. So I just kind of hoped that maybe it was something where I was going to have a deeper appreciation for what he was doing in this film. The second he appears on screen, though, all of that goes out the window because his performance just annoys me like nobody else's performance really ever has, and I don't think ever will for a long time. I get his motivation right off the bat, that he's paranoid about metahumans and he wants, he kind of has an agenda against them. That's kind of framed around this deterrent argument where he's trying to convince the senators that he wants a deterrent against these metahumans, when in reality he just has a vendetta against Supermans and metahumans and things like that. And it's really like, I said in these notes that I didn't hate him as much as I thought I did in the very, very first scenes when he's just playing basketball, because I'm like, yeah, he's kind of a nerdy Silicon Valley version of Lex Luthor. And then we get to the Jolly Rancher scene, and I guess there's a couple other things that happen in between that, but he's so bizarre and lacks any kind of weightiness as a character. And I have this dislike of characters who are just zany and weird for the sake of being zany and weird. And then you get this Jolly Rancher scene, which is so uncomfortable, and it's not even, there's no point to it other than the fact that it's just making him feel so eccentric, which I get it. Like, you can be eccentric. RDJ's Iron Man was eccentric, but he wasn't like crazy like this, And again, Jesse Eisenberg is a fantastic actor. I mean, he's done a great job. He did a great job in The Social Network as Mark Zuckerberg. It feels like Zack Snyder asked him to basically play Mark Zuckerberg, but like crazy, not necessarily, more, not on the more calculating side, but on the more just zany, like almost Jim Carrey Riddler version of this character. And I just couldn't buy it. There's nothing about this character that I could buy. And on top of that, his performance annoys me to no end. And so, yeah, we get introduced to his character, and he's obviously going to be a very pivotal point in this film. Though again, like going back to the original point, he feels almost like he is an antagonist more to Batman than he is to Superman. But we'll kind of talk about that as we progress. So yeah, we're about a third into the film, and if you can't tell, because I'm going through this film linearly, I'm going through this film chronologically, there's a lot going on in the beginning of this movie, and I think that there's this dilemma about that's going on in the film that Superman is trying to address, or the world is trying to address with Superman, about who lives and who dies. And that's sort of the more superhero registration act kind of part of this, where we have to keep Superman accountable in some way. So that's sort of a subplot that's beginning to emerge. But then you have all these other subplots that are beginning to emerge about Batman, the White Portuguese. You're going to see Wonder Woman appear later. You have Lex Luthor. You have this subplot with Lois Lane, with the African bullet, and so or I guess the U.S. made bullet found in Africa. And it's just a lot that's going on. And again, I have nothing against films inherently that have a lot going on, but it's about balance, right? And one thing I wrote in my notes at this point is just that the movie's messy. There's no individual part other than, save for Jesse Eisenberg's Lex Luthor, that I dislike particularly. Maybe the scene in Africa was a little bit confusing, but I suppose the intent there was to flesh it out a little bit more later on. But like I said, I love the opening with Batman, and I think that the parts with Superman are okay. It's just that these parts aren't coalescing in a way that makes sense. And again, I get why people hate Superman, like people in general hate Superman, because of what happened in Metropolis, and I get why people hate Batman because he's kind of a menace, and I get why Batman hates Superman. But one thing that's missing at this point is I just don't see why Superman has a reason to hate Batman. And so that doesn't become clear. And spoiler alert, it won't become clear until about the beginning of the third act. So that's something to keep an eye on as well. Okay, so then now we have Bruce Wayne kind of meeting this Russian, I believe he's Russian, KG Beast. I think he's KG Beast, although Wikipedia seems to think that he is not officially KG Beast, but the henchman of Lex Luthor. So Bruce Wayne meets him there and is tracking his phone. And yeah, I mean, I think that, we also get these scenes about Gotham itself as sort of a character, where people are describing Gotham as sort of a and I'm going to be very careful with what I say here, because this is just how I want to be representative of what people in the film are saying about Gotham, as sort of a city that is sort of riddled with crime, and then has this vigilante going about and committing vigilante justice. I think that's another super interesting angle to take, and I would have loved to have seen that explored more in the DCEU. Obviously, it wasn't at all. We didn't really get to see Gotham again at all. So there's that. But yeah, so then we have scenes with Lois investigating the bullet, and her theory is that the U.S. was providing the rebels with these bullets to draw in Superman, so then Lex could have a reason to get the kryptonite. It's all this sort of convoluted mess that sort of ends up with Lex getting kryptonite at the end of the day. So what can I say? He being Lex has this conversation with Senator Finch, played by Holly Hunter, who I like many of my fellow Pixar film-loving fans, recognize as Elastigirl, although she is a prolific actress in her own right. But yeah, he has this conversation with Senator Finch, and I just hate this whole the red capes are coming, which was in the trailer. The wig looks terrible. I'm not trying to hate on Jesse Eisenberg. I just think that this iteration of Lex Luthor is one of the worst comic book characters I've seen probably ever. And to be fair, I haven't really seen a lot of the terrible, Batman and Robins of the world, but man, this film came out in 2016, and this was a character that was in it. So really bad. I just really, 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 really bad. But yeah, the senator sees through Lex because, she's understanding that he doesn't really want a deterrent against these metahumans. He just doesn't like Superman. Yeah, I mean, so this, at this point now, it's getting to the point where the movie is not just a little bit too much, but it's getting to be kind of a bloated mess, we even have time for this sort of weird dream sequence flashback where Bruce is at Martha's tomb, and then we get to see Man-Bat for some reason. I believe it's Man-Bat. I could be totally wrong about that. I know the only reason that he's at Martha's tomb is because of the Martha scene that they have to set up later. You can do all the foreshadowing you want. It doesn't necessarily make for an effective payoff. We'll get to that. But yeah, I mean, it feels like the movie is... It doesn't feel like, it feels like the movie is trying to is obliged to set up these things, and so it has to include all these different scenes. But again, it's not it's not well balanced. You know, it feels so incredibly bloated. And the other thing about the movie too is that unlike a film that is maybe, you know, on the lighter side that has all these different subplots, the movie is incredibly dour. You know, these characters just feel so sad and dark, and there's nothing inherently wrong with that. Like, one of my favorite comic book movie films is Logan, and that's a film where the characters are just so, you know, down on themselves, especially Logan. But you have moments of heart, right? You have moments like Charles Xavier finding the warmth in that scene with the family, for example. And this is just a film where everyone feels like they're so down on themselves, and it's just kind of, it makes the film a little bit of a drag at certain points. And then speaking of incredibly bloated at this point, we have another subplot now where Diana Prince shows up at this Lex Luthor, I don't know, gala or whatever it is, where Clark Kent and Bruce Wayne meet up, and the Lex Luthor speech is probably the worst Lex Luthor scene in the entire film. If you didn't think it could get worse, it got worse. This speech where he's just stumbling over his words and pretending to be this tech CEO billionaire. It's so hard to believe that, you know, Lex would just talk like this. It's also so hard to believe, by the way, that he would just leave that server room open without any security, that Batman can just kind of walk in and put that device on the thing, the whatever that server is, and then Diana can just steal it without anyone except Mercy Graves, Lex Luthor's assistant, just kind of being like, "Oh, what are you up to?" And then Batman's like, "Oh, I just lost my way. I couldn't find the bathroom." It's so hard to believe. And on top of that, we're hearing Lex Luthor speaking in the background, and it's just this uncomfortable speech that, again, it's not fun to listen to. It's like nails on a chalkboard for me, guys. I can't explain it. If you guys enjoy the performance, I have no beef with you or anything like that. For me, it's so hard to listen to. Then we get that scene that was in that, you know, I talked about at the beginning of the third trailer, where where Clark Kent and Bruce Wayne are talking to one another. And one thing I can't help but notice here is that, and it's interesting because I'm making comparisons. Like I always say, I'm not just trying to compare the DCU to the MCU, but it's just a relevant comparison because these are sort of the two big superhero franchises that were going on at the time. And so when Tony Stark and Captain America first met for the first time, Steve Rogers and Tony Stark, there was also antagonism between the two, right? If you remember in the first Avengers, they were sort of at odds with one another. But that antagonism sort of felt, there was some palpable tension there, right? And then later on, when they became friends, like in Endgame, you know, there's chemistry there between the two characters. And chemistry doesn't necessarily mean friendship, right? Because, like I say, Tony Stark and Captain America were at odds with one another when they first encountered each other in the Avengers. With this first encounter with Bruce Wayne and Clark Kent, I just don't feel any chemistry at all. I just, when Clark is like, you know, what do you think about the Bat Vigilante in Gotham? And then Bruce is just kind of being dour and brooding. And, you know, perhaps this was intentional to kind of have these characters be standoffish, but it doesn't really make sense. It also doesn't really make sense, you know, how Lex Luthor knows who Clark is, other than maybe just kind of a Daily Planet reporter. I do like how Superman was able to hear the Alfred audio in Batman's ear, so he kind of figures out there that Bruce Wayne is Batman, which is pretty cool. But yeah, I mean, and then now Wonder Woman is entering the picture, and she takes Bruce's device, and then Superman has to leave to save some people, and it's, again, we're just moving back and forth, and then all these different subplots. And so I want to reiterate again, I don't hate anything in the movie particularly individually, because there are a lot of really good things going on. I continue at this point to like Bruce Wayne's Batman. I think that some of the subplots with Superman and whether or not he's accountable and responsible for his actions are very interesting. Also it also really good philosophical questions about whether or not, you know, what happens to people when they follow these godlike beings. By the way, Neil deGrasse Tyson makes a cameo on a news channel, which is kind of funny, I guess. I don't know. But yeah, I mean, you know, they're talking about, you know, superhero accountability and the government's role in that. All of this is super interesting. But again, nothing has time to be fleshed out, because that's really not what the film is about. Like, what you paid admission for is to see Batman and Superman fight. And while I'm not saying that this film can't have complex ideas, because it definitely can and it should, we're not seeing any sort of forward momentum heading in that direction, if that makes sense. And it just kind of feels like a movie that has so many different ideas that it wants to grapple with. And it just doesn't feel like it has time for that. So it's again continuing to be frustrated about all of that. Anyways, speaking of, I feel like I've been saying this a lot. By the way, guys, I just want to make it clear, if you've been listening thus far into the podcast and you're enjoying what you hear, thank you so much again for taking the time to listen. I know this is a longer podcast episode, but I took a lot of notes. I really paid attention to the film, and I really wanted to get as much out of it as possible. Like I always say, I'm here to really to try to enjoy these films as much as I possibly can, because again, it's not my own fault, but my own loss if I don't get as much enjoyment out of them as I can. If I'm being very critical, it's not because it invalidates your opinion if you really like the film. It's just me trying to share my thoughts in as in-depth of a way as I possibly can, and I appreciate you guys listening very, very much. But if it sounds like I'm a little exasperated, it's just because I'm kind of remembering as I read through my notes what I was feeling as I was watching the movie. And speaking of exasperation, it's time for the Bat Vision. Which, now that we know sort of what Zack Snyder's plan was for the rest of his Justice League films, this is just clear and blatant Justice League setup, right? We have, the Batman vision in the desert, the Nightmare vision with a K. We see the Omega symbol, the dark side symbol, and then, setting up the evil Superman. Again, the visuals are great. The parademons look cool. It's really a great, well shot scene. But at the end of the movie, it's clear that this really wasn't relevant, because then we get, Flash as coming in from the future, and he says, "Look, Lois is the key." And while, Batman, I guess, acknowledges Lois in the movie, it's not like he really thinks about her as anything super important in this movie. And so, again, just clear Justice League setup for the sake of Justice League setup. I did also want to say, though, that, while I'm not the biggest fan of the Snyder films, what I will say about, because I do think it's relevant, right? I don't want to talk too much about this whole Snyderverse, fandom, and there are some very toxic sides to it, and there are very people who just want to see the vision restored, and I think that's great. I'm not here for the sort of toxic fandom that has spawned out of this Snyderverse, which is not Zack Snyder's fault, but it is what it is. I just thought I had to say that, but. I think it is relevant to talk a little bit about this whole restore the Snyderverse kind of thing, just to say that. Look, I'm not the biggest fan of Zack Snyder's films. Nothing about him as a person or anything like that, just his films. Man of Steel I thought was good. I didn't think it was great. I just thought it was good. Batman v Superman, so far, as I'm going through these notes, I think the film is kind of a bloated mess, but it has potential. And that's really, at the very least, right? Zack Snyder had a singular vision, and while it's a really weird thing, because while I never really liked any of his projects individually, or at least never loved any of his projects individually, what I will say is that when it comes to the prospect of, in a world where would you like to see, the rest of his Snyder films, if you could just snap your fingers and they'd be there, would you like to see them, or would you like to not see them? I would like to see them. And this includes all the setup that was going on in his Snyder cut of the evil Superman and all that stuff that you see a little bit here, because again, he had a really interesting vision, I think, at least, and it wasn't the story that I think a lot of us necessarily wanted to see here. But again, I think for what it's worth, that this Nightmare vision is really interesting. In the Snyder cut, the epilogue is interesting. The setup that they do with Darkseid is also interesting, and so. While I am not, again, the biggest personal fan of Zack Snyder's work, I will give him credit and say that he had a vision, and it was something that in a world where would I like to see it or would I not like to see it, I think that, I think that it had my attention enough. In this movie, though, I don't know. In this movie, it just didn't feel like it was super warranted, and I guess, it's fun to see those clips on YouTube if you want to look up the Nightmare sequence. But, I guess there's that. So then, anyways, we move on. And Perry White, by the way, this is just something I noticed throughout this movie, is I just don't understand how Clark Kent didn't get fired from his job, because it keeps cutting back to Perry White at the Daily Planet, and he's always like, "Where's Clark Kent?" And my question is always just why and how have Clark Kent not been fired yet? It's such a minor thing. But anyways, yeah, I mean, then we get on to this the Batmobile chase, where he's on the white Portuguese and on the boat. And again, one of Zack Snyder's strength is the visuals, and there are some shots here in this film that are just absolutely gorgeous, like the one where he's standing on top of the boat tower. There's the shot where it kind of pans around his cape and he's kind of, it's kind of floating in the wind. Really gorgeous shot. Really, 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 really love that shot. Here we go with the Batmobile chase, though. And I mean, the Batmobile in this universe, I really like it, although doesn't really get to stick around. It comes about in the Justice League film a little bit. I will say, and it's not fair because we have now the Robert Pattinson Batman film to compare this to, it's a little hard to see what's going on because it's so dark and there are a lot of cuts going on, versus the Pattinson Batmobile chase. I felt like it was a little bit more clear and coherent. And at certain points, it actually is very difficult to see what was going on. But when you do see what's going on and you see, like he's going after the truck, it's a really cool scene. Hans Zimmer, by the way, I haven't given him his kudos yet, and I have to give him his kudos every single time he does a film with a score like this. I said in Man of Steel he was one of the best parts of it, and he continues to be one of the best parts of the DCEU. Fantastic score. I also just love the Batmobile just being a tank, basically, like going, through things and coming out of explosions, and I love that. And it's even further accentuated when Superman just kind of shows up and he stands there and flips the Batmobile, just by having the Batmobile hit him, which is, I think it's just so, it's funny in the way that it's not like laugh out loud funny, but in that moment it works. It works in the drama as well. It's one thing that's kind of interesting though is that I wonder if Superman knew at the time if Batman was trying to get the kryptonite, because while obviously Batman was using the kryptonite for to attack Superman, was going to use the kryptonite to attack Superman, so was Lex. And so I don't know if Superman, obviously he can't really, I guess, touch the kryptonite because that would weaken him, I suppose. But there had to have been a way where, Superman could have gotten the kryptonite. It's a nitpick anyways, but just something that I noticed as the film was going on. We get one of the quintessential shots of this film, though, which is fantastic, where, the Batmobile is crashed and Superman is standing over the cockpit, or the driver's seat, and Batman stands up to face him. One of the best shots of the film, one of the best shots just ever in comic book movies. I mean, there was a time when you just did not think you were going to see a shot like that in a superhero film. It's one of those kind of Avengers circle shot kind of moments. Later on, you get to see the Trinity together, Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman, the DC Trinity. It's just fantastic. Some of these shots, it really looked like, they had storyboarded from the very beginning, and I appreciate that. We get some encouragement from Ma Kent, and then we get that scene where Superman is in court. And so I guess before that though, we have this other subplot that I read was added into the film in the Ultimate Edition, with this woman who actually lied about the fact that her family was killed in Africa because she was paid, I think by LexCorp and by Lex to frame Superman and make him look even worse. But she has second thoughts about that. It's interesting. And I think, it's interesting to see the lengths that Lex was going to frame Superman from the beginning. And we get that scene in the courtroom with Holly Hunter. I will say that it does strike me as a little bit awkward, the way that Holly Hunter is playing that, where she sees the Granny's peach tea, which, what a callback, right, to what Lex Luthor was talking about earlier. But the way that she kind of begins to stutter over her words is a little weird. And I don't know. I mean, yikes. Also, that Mercy Graves is in that courtroom, and Lex is just like, yep, let's just blow everyone up. That was crazy. It just feels contrived to get at a point where we're like, yeah, okay, we can blame Superman for this, and then we can also get Lex's kryptonite to him and whatnot. All of it feels very contrived, and I don't want to conflate contrived and complex, because I think complex is always a good thing if you can execute it well. It just feels like there were a lot of steps that were taken in this regard where it didn't feel like it was warranted that it needed to be this complex. But at any rate, you also have Lex sending these weird Joker-like notes to Batman, which I don't know if that's what Lex thinks is gonna get Batman angry. I mean, Batman's already angry, and then Superman's now just really sad. even sadder than he was in the beginning of this film. I guess in the beginning of the film, he was just mad about everything. Uh, Great. I mean, it's still very clear why Batman thinks Superman is a threat. And again, Batman's motivation is great, but Superman is just sad. And at this point, by the way, it's about, I would say, maybe 2/3 into the film, and it's still just not clear what Superman really wants in this movie, which is frustrating because it's one thing if this film was called Batman, Dawn of Justice, and then Superman was the antagonist, I suppose. Even that would have been a little iffy, but it's one thing to have that, but this is Batman v Superman. And it's frustrating because like I said, you were getting to the point at the end of Man of Steel where you were beginning to understand where Superman was coming from, and you were beginning to see the humanity in this character, and he's just so pushed to the sideline in this film, which again, I understand it's not a Superman film, but it's not just a Batman film either. And I think that they did such a good job with Batman in this film where he is motivated to fight Superman. And again, he makes mistakes, but he doesn't make mistakes in the sense that it doesn't make sense for the character. Like, he makes mistakes because he's an angry and jaded individual who's seen some really terrible things. And it's just, I just wish that Superman was given that same kind of development in this film instead of devoting all this time to this Lex subplot. Anyways, we get a Batman training montage, and respect to Ben Affleck, he's absolutely ripped. And then they had the Wonder Woman email scene where she's opening up the emails for the Justice League. Actually, I think that comes later, but I think Batman at this point is just looking through the Justice League files, and he sees the Wonder Woman file. So scratch that, because I thought at this point in the film that Ben Affleck's character, Batman, is going to open up the Justice League files, but it's Wonder Woman later. But he sees Wonder Woman's picture, setting up her little thing, her entrance at the end of the movie. It's funny too because I forgot that the Wonder Woman riff, the guitar riff, was in this movie at first instead of the actual Wonder Woman film, and it's become sort of her entrance music, I suppose. But yeah, now Lex, who was inexplicably granted full access to the Kryptonian vessel, is now experimenting with Zod's body, and he puts his own blood into it for some inexplicable reason. And I mean, I don't know. At this point, it's almost like one too many subplots. Then we have this scene where Superman is kind of climbing up this mountain, and he sees this apparition of his dad. Again, this scene in its own right, on its own, nothing bad about it. It's a good kind of scene. Chris Terrio and David S. Goyer love their apparition dad talking to their son in a moment of crisis. See Star Wars Episode 9, The Rise of Skywalker for that as well. I believe that they both are either just Chris Terrio or both of them wrote that film. I mean, I think that it's interesting too, and I want to be very sensitive about how I say this, but it's you have this film, like I said, about how dour this movie is. At this point in the film, you have, I believe there's a line where both characters, like Superman, I don't think is going to kill himself. Again, I want to be very sensitive about that. I'm just talking about the film in its own right, but it's this point where he's so low, that he might it's almost like he's going up to the mountains to kind of just die alone. And then you have this other scene where Alfred confronts Batman in Wayne Manor, and he's like, "You're gonna die," and Batman's like, maybe, but I'm gonna take him out. And just to kind of illustrate where we are in this film, you have both characters who are basically on the verge of accepting their own deaths. And that's, I don't know. I mean, if that doesn't kind of explain how the tone of this film is working thus far, I don't know what will. And oh yeah, by the way, Superman's mom gets captured, so that we can have our Martha subplot and Martha scene. For some reason, that's kind of where we're at with this film. So yeah, I mean, again, I'm not hating anything individually. I'm just kind of watching along, kind of, following along the film. But there's just a lot of messiness going on with this movie. Anyways, then Lex Luthor now is going to egg Superman on to fight Batman because he wants them to fight for some reason. I guess one of them is going to kill the other, and then I don't know if he's going to kill. I don't know. I really just don't know. And yeah, I mean, you asked the question of why Superman is going to listen to Lex and actually fight him. And then it's because he's holding his mom captive, so that's why that had to happen. It makes a little bit of sense, but the problem I have with this is not that it doesn't make sense that Superman is going to listen to Lex, or at the very least he's not going to kill Lex in this moment, instead of going to fight Batman. That's all fine because I get that Superman loves his mom, and that totally makes sense to me. What doesn't, or what I guess what bothers me is that this motivation for Superman to fight Batman, because you had this whole film, right, to set up the motivation for why Batman wants to take out Superman, and it's well set up. It makes sense why Batman is jaded and what he's gone through. Superman's motivation to fight Batman comes up in 30 seconds, in this one scene in 30 seconds, where Lex Luthor is like, I got your mom, go get him. And that's just so frustrating to me. It's like they paid so much attention to this Batman character and just so little to the Superman character. It's incredibly frustrating. By the way, tagline for this movie is, I think Superman says it, no one stays good in this world. Lovely. It's a lovely tagline. It fits what's going on in this movie. Anyways, yeah, so now we get Wonder Woman opening up the Justice League files. I don't know. It's just kind of cringy. This didn't need to be in the film at all. This could have been the post-credit scene for all I cared, but it just did not need to be in the film. And by the way, speaking of Lois Lane doing crazy things, she convinces Perry to fly her into Gotham City towards the Batman light in a helicopter, which is crazy. Anyways, yeah, so now we get the start of the Batman v Superman fight. So at this point, this is what we're here for. And I have to say as well that Cavill's performance is not great here, in my opinion. He sounds pretty wooden. When he says, you don't understand, it sounds very, I hate to compare it in this way, but almost Hayden Christensen, Anakin Skywalker in a sense, which I know is going to be sacrilegious to some of you guys, and I apologize. This is just my opinion. This is just how this hit me. But yeah, I mean, it's just frustrating because, there's so many things in this film that are great because the fight itself is great. If you just took the fight and didn't really, cut out the beginning, cut out the end, it's fantastic, right? And it's taking big, this film is taking big swings, and I really appreciate the movie for that. I just lament the fact that not a lot of it is kind of landing the way that I think it was intentional, or the way that it was intended to. The one thing I will say about the fight, too, is that I wish that there were a limited number of kryptonite grenades. It's just kind of a cheesy thing. It almost feels a little video gamey, but just to kind of give a little bit of, sense of stake, because I think Superman gets hit twice with the kryptonite grenades, and I almost wish that Batman was like, oops, I'm out, and then, he has to resort to other things. But anyways, yeah. By the way, I think that there should be no debate in the fact that Batman won the fight, right? Because Lois Lane and Martha basically saved Superman from dying. But yeah, I mean, I think there's no question that Batman won that fight. And I mean, for all the people saying, well, he used kryptonite, of course he used kryptonite. There's no other way to kill Superman other than with kryptonite. So yeah, I think that it was a really good fight. Whether or not it was worth it to kind of sit through the first 2 hours to get to the fight, don't know, because once I was watching the fight, I was kind of detaching from anything else that was going on and just watching the fight as a fight, which I don't think is a particularly, good thing for the film. I wanted to watch the Martha scene as we get to it. Again, just watching the scene in its own right, not taking any of my preconceived baggages into it, just like Jesse Eisenberg as Lex Luthor, but just like Jesse Eisenberg as Lex Luthor, the scene came off just as poorly as it did the first time. It's so comical and it's just in all the wrong ways. I get it. I understand the underlying theme in this scene, that there is a shared humanity between Batman and Superman, that they both have mothers and they both care about their mothers, even though one is a jaded mortal and the other is basically a godlike being. But the execution is just awful in this scene. And now they're basically just cool with one another. I mean, it's to the point where when Batman rescues Martha Kent, he refers to Superman as his friend. And it's like, I don't get how we got to that point, because Batman was so convinced that Superman was such a danger to this world. just doesn't make sense. It happens so quickly and so abruptly, and just in such a weird way that it's just one of the things about this movie, man, that's just so frustrating. But for everything that's frustrating about this movie, you have to have something good. And the next scene is the warehouse fight. And the warehouse fight, yeah, is incredible. I know that there's a lot that people have said about Batman not killing, and I'm willing to overlook it, which might upset a lot of hardcore comic book readers, because I know that he has his code. I don't think that this Batman is sort of in that headspace. I think that this is a Batman who is just so beyond jaded and cynical, and perhaps is on his way back from that. But still, I think that it's just a fantastic fight scene, and I again, Zack Snyder does his fights well. He does his cinematography well, and so it's really good, and just they did so many little things right with this jaded older version of Batman, and just it makes me actually really want to see the Ben Affleck version of the Batman even more, even though I loved the Pattinson version. But I digress. Also, though, just to cap off that fight scene, the amazing fight scene, you have to, the one like written joke, or I guess the one of two written jokes in the film, that both of which, by the way, don't land at all, with this weird scene where Martha kind of gives this MCU quip of like, or Batman's like, "I'm a friend of your son's," and then Martha's like, "Oh, I figured the cape," and I'm like, what? It's not funny, and like I said, he calls Superman his friend, and it's just so confusing to me why they decided to insert that little bit of humor in there, in that moment. It just doesn't work. So yeah, there's that. Now we get into the introduction of Doomsday. We're finally getting towards the very final climax of the film. Doomsday looks hideous. CGI, actually, the CGI itself for the design of the character is pretty good. I think, like, in terms of the model and the shadow reflections and stuff like that. And I will say that, while this Doomsday looks hideous, it's not like the comic version, in my opinion, at least from what I've seen, looks any less, like palatable to the eyes. It's also just a hideous kind of creature. So yeah, the CGI isn't bad, and then you get even more destruction of Metropolis, even though they're trying to have it be in a more abandoned part of the city. Then their strategy is to fire a nuke at Superman and Doomsday, which obviously doesn't work. Doesn't kill either of them. And then Wonder Woman arrives, which is great. I mean, she's great in the movie. I think that we're not going to get to the first Wonder Woman for a couple more episodes, but Gal Gadot is pretty good in this limited screen time. She has the screen presence to kind of match up against with Batman and Superman. And I also think that for me, as someone who hasn't sort of been waiting for this moment for years, even decades, it must have been, I can't even imagine what it was like to have to be able to see the trinity of Batman and Superman and Wonder Woman together on screen for the first time, and that iconic shot, which again was spoiled in that third trailer, but we're not going to talk about that for much longer. It must have been just something otherworldly, and if nothing else can be said about this movie, at least that there was that one shot and this one scene where they're all fighting together in tandem. By the way, while all this is happening, Lois Lane is off trying to throw the kryptonite spear into the water, and then she has to go get it again. Okay, just giving Lois Lane something to do, I suppose. The character at the end of the day seems incredibly wasted, honestly, and just doesn't seem to have a lot. It's almost like Snyder just didn't know what to do with her after this Bullet subplot, and she just gets relegated onto this weird solo side quest. So yeah. Anyways, in regards to the Snyderverse, I just as we kind of wrap up this film, I like I said, I almost wish that he was shepherding the vision for this Snyderverse as a whole, rather than directing each one of these films, because like I said, I think that the visions for these films are really interesting, and it's singular, but it just doesn't feel. It feels like wasted potential at the end of the day, because you have all this stuff that's going on, like the Trinity fighting and Superman and Batman and Wonder Woman and all these things. But when Superman dies, right? So we get to the point now where Superman flies with this kryptonite spear and kills Doomsday, but then is killed. I just don't feel anything for this character, and I think I would have if we got maybe a second Man of Steel with the ending of the first Man of Steel, where we got to see this really optimistic Superman who is then put through this crazy trial of Batman in this movie with Doomsday. I just don't feel anything about this Superman, and that's really disappointing. And so, yeah, I mean, the film ends. The third act ends really with Superman's death, which even in theaters at the time, I knew that wasn't going to be it. But you got to have your stakes somehow, even though those stakes are going to be reversed in pretty much the next film in the sequence. Anyways, we get some Justice League setup with Steppenwolf, and I think that now is as good of a time as any to talk about what was different about the Ultimate Edition. I went on some websites and found basically all the differences that were in the Ultimate Edition compared to the theatrical cut. I've been addressing them sort of as I go, but just wanted to kind of quickly have an aside here and talk about whether or not I think the Ultimate Edition was a big and vast improvement upon the theatrical edition. So, one of the big things was making it rated R, which I don't think made its presence that known in this movie, but sure. The Africa subplot was beefed up a little bit, and you had Jimmy Olsen, which I think was actually one of the worst things that the Ultimate Edition did, showing a bit more of Superman and how he was flamed, like how the flamethrowers were used to sort of mimic the heat vision, which I think is it's good context. You had that character, also that woman who was testifying and then felt guilty about it, which again is fleshing out that subplot. You have a scene of Clark Kent going to Gotham City to kind of see what people think about the Batman, which I think is interesting. I can't believe that this wasn't in the film. I was shocked to hear this. Superman, right after the Senate building is blown up, is seen helping people out of the building, which is crazy. But I do kind of have this distinct memory, or vague memory, sorry, of in the theatrical cut, Superman just kind of flying away from the building, which at the time it was just kind of like, okay, like, sure. So it is a little bit helpful to see him doing that in the Ultimate Edition. You have Steppenwolf as well. You have Jenna Malone playing the lab character who apparently works for Star Labs and is helping Lois with the bullet. And I think that's about it for the differences between the theatrical and the Ultimate Edition. Whether or not I think it helps the film, I think that it certainly doesn't hurt, right, to have this additional information. I don't think much of it, other than maybe the Jimmy Olsen stuff, is a detriment to the film in itself. But I will say that while I think it is helpful to flesh out these different subplots, I also while I think that watching the regular theatrical edition would have been pretty, a bit more confusing without all these additional scenes, I don't think that it's enough to significantly change my opinion about the film, if that makes sense. So, just thought I'd interject that here as we wrap up this play-by-play. Thank you guys again if you guys are still listening. I know this has been a long one, but wanted to be as thorough as possible. So, we get these dueling funerals. Dueling funerals sounds really weird. These parallel funerals going on, one for Superman and one for Clark. How Perry doesn't know at this point that Clark Kent is Superman, even if he thinks, okay, like Clark Kent disappears and he dies in all the destruction in Metropolis, and then obviously Superman dies, and he's like, well, I guess one could have happened without the other. He should have just stopped for 5 seconds to think about the fact that they look basically the same. One with glasses and one without. I don't know. It's weird. And also the fact that Superman keeps saving Lois. Anyways, it's just one of those dumb things. Hans Zimmer's score, though, here is as beautiful as always. He's playing the original Man of Steel theme. And then we get more Lex Luthor with just probably the second most unhinged scene that he has in the movie next to his speech at the Gala, where he's saying, the ring ding ding, the devil has come, or whatever he's saying in our, in the prison cell. And then we get, it feels like we have 50 endings, but the final one is Lois grabbing the dirt, putting it on the coffin, and then the dirt rises, even though it doesn't seem like Superman's alive in that moment. Maybe that's just symbolism for the fact that they were going to resurrect him anyways. But yeah, I mean, in Justice League, it seems like a dead body that they're resurrecting. So I don't know. Maybe, I think it's just foreshadowing for what was going to come. But yeah, guys, that's Batman v Superman. That's the Ultimate Edition. I'm gonna make this next section as brief as I can, as I know we've been going on for a long time here. Thank you guys again so much for sticking around. as we do this. I found this to be very insightful because, again, what I hope you're able to see here is that you're getting sort of almost a live play-by-play as to my thoughts on the film as I'm watching the film in real time. Obviously, this is not, it's a third of the length of the actual film, which in itself is kind of crazy. But yeah, you're getting my thoughts on the film kind of as I'm going along with it. And for those of you who know the channel, because I'm sure that there will be some of you who just think my opinion is terrible and you think that I'm crazy talking about all these things, and that's totally fine. Like I say, if we can have a respectful conversation in the comments, that's all I can ask for. But for those of you who know me and know this channel, you know that my goal is always to just think critically about these films, but enjoy them as much as possible. And there was enjoyment to be had, for sure, from Batman v Superman. Like I said, I think Ben Affleck's Batman was a standout, and I really, really do wish we got his solo Batman film. I think that, the visuals, obviously the fights themselves were fantastic. A lot of the ideas, especially of the Justice League future that Zack Snyder was setting up, were really interesting. But at the end of the day, this film is a bloated mess. And honestly, it's a weird feeling because as we kind of talk about how my feelings have changed from the last time I saw this film to now, which was a long time ago, to be fair, but it just to compare the two, it's weird because I feel like I like some things even more than I did before. Like, I am really on board with Ben Affleck's Batman after seeing this film, but I like some things less. Like, I really am not on board anymore with Henry Cavill's Superman, not because of Henry Cavill necessarily or the potential of this Superman, which we saw in Man of Steel, but because they wasted it in this film, in my opinion. Other things like just the convoluted nature of the subplots with the Bullet from Africa, that Lex Luthor was giving to these rebels, and then all that kind of stuff, with Steppenwolf, with Doomsday. While the Justice League setup is cool, it just didn't feel like it needed to be in the film. Wonder Woman's also in the film. It's just a lot of things. I think even Wonder Woman I really liked in the movie, but her inclusion in there, that felt more obligatory for the Dawn of Justice part of the film rather than the Batman v Superman part of the film as well. So coming out of this movie for this time around, especially like if this, for example, like if my experience with Man of Steel in this rewatch, and my experience now with Batman v Superman, the Ultimate Edition, were sort of my starting points for how I was viewing the future of the DCEU. Like, let's just say I'm going into Suicide Squad now and going into Justice League now, kind of fresh. What would my anticipation levels be? I think that I would be kind of, mildly excited about these upcoming films because I think that, it's clear that they're building up this universe, but I think that I would be a little hesitant, especially with Zack Snyder back at the helm. Because, like I said, I respect his vision very much, but I think that the two films that he made really just haven't clicked with me on that kind of level. I did like Man of Steel, but this film, more so than the first one, felt like it took a lot of big swings, but it really didn't connect. So, as somebody who obviously has seen all these films before, I kind of know what to expect, but just putting myself in the shoes of somebody who maybe wouldn't have seen the films before and had the same experience that I had rewatching these films. I would be excited to see Ben Affleck's Batman again and Gal Gadot's Wonder Woman, and we would be excited to see the introduction of new characters into the Justice League. But, I think with that kind of cautious optimism that just kind of bums me out a little bit because, it's just, you just can't really get on board all the way. That being said, guys, thank you so much for sticking around to the end of this podcast. I know that we've been going for over an hour now. I really appreciate it. I hope that you guys enjoyed this podcast episode. We're able to tune in, hear my thoughts on the film, hear what I had to say, and would love most of all for you guys to chime in the comments down below. I really just, the point of this is to have a conversation about the movie, and not to just hear my own voice, to hear what you guys have to say about it as well. We will be back at some point with Suicide Squad, the original, not the James Gunn, but the David Ayer Suicide Squad. As of the recording of this video, there is no Ayer cut, and even if there was, we wouldn't be watching that until much later anyways in this rewatch chronology. So we will be watching the theatrical cut of Suicide Squad, and then, like I mentioned I believe in the Man of Steel video, we will be watching the theatrical cut of Justice League before we get to the Zack Snyder cut. We'll be watching the Zack Snyder cut when it comes around in the 2021 slot. I believe after Wonder Woman 84. So we won't get to that for a little bit, but yeah, I mean, we'll be watching both versions of Justice League, and I'll be giving my honest thoughts on both of them. In the meantime, guys, thank you so much again for listening. If you haven't subscribed to the Access Blockbusters YouTube channel, make sure to do so. And I will see you guys in the next one.